So today I'm really glad to introduce Professor Alan Nutman to all of you. He's a very well-known scientist who studied about the Eoarchean, the oldest existing formations in the Earth, geological formations. There has been so many matters of interest for all of us to see how the geology of the oldest rocks look like. So I am really glad to let you know that Professor Alan Nutman will be giving you a lecture on his field experiences in Greenland, and about even talk about the life and how the life emerged in the earliest time. So it's almost, I suppose most of the students are getting in. It's still, there are people coming in, but still let us start with Alan, please. Can you, of course, introduce yourself also a little bit, because students might be interested to know about your previous experiences as well. Alan, please.
Okay, there's not much to say about me. I've been working on the early Earth for much too long. And I'm just going to give you just a little overview of what we think about the earliest record of on our planet. And I will go a little bit even before that. When I start talking about biology, I'll go a little into astrobiology. So to save bandwidth, I'm now going to turn my video off, and I'm going to share screen with the presentation, which will be in 3 bits, as you've already seen from the program. Okay, so I'm just going to first of all stop my video, and then I'm going to share screen. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is in three bits. We're going to be looking at the early history of the Earth, or the earliest history of the Earth, which is readily accessible. That's going to be focusing mostly on the record in Greenland, where it is best preserved. So basically, we can call it half a century of working on difficult rocks, because in a way, they are about the most difficult rocks in the world to interpret, but it's still important because they give a viewpoint of what was happening very early on the planet, and give you, for example, was plate tectonics an extremely ancient thing? When did life start on Earth? And other fundamental questions. So why half a century of the Eoarchean? Well, it's just over 50 years since this very important paper came out, which was led by a group of people from the Oxford Isotope Geology Laboratory, 1971. This presented the first evidence of surviving Eoarchean, in other words, more than 3,600 million year old rocks on Earth. And since then, of course, there's been lots of progress, but some of the controversies remaining from those very early days are still continuing, as you'll see today. So the Eoarchean is not a point in time, okay? The Eoarchean is 4,000 to 3,600 million years ago. So that's a long time. It's not just a point in time. People tend to think of it just as a point in time, but if you lay it alongside part of the Phanerozoic, you can see it stretches from now way back actually into the Paleozoic. So it is a very long period of time, and a lot can, of course, happen in 400 million years. So, of course, the most important thing when you're looking at history, first of all, is to get the order of events correct. And the technique which is mostly used these days for actually getting the age of rocks is zircon geochronology, particularly using various what are called in situ techniques, where you actually analyze individual parts of zircons, because zircons do grow by sort of tree rings, and you can actually record several different events from single zircons. So this style of zircon works actually dates from the 1980s, early 1980s. And the middle picture there shows the prototype Shrimp-1 instrument, which was the first instrument in the world which could actually undertake that kind of work. And the top picture there shows sort of one of its modern succeeding instruments, the so-called RG instrument in the Australian National University. So you need this great big tool in order to do very delicate work. And the reason for that is that zircons in some of the critical early Earth units are very tiny and rare. So you need a very delicate technique which doesn't destroy everything. So one of the pictures there, the tiny zircon, it's only 40 microns across. And this is a volcanogenic grain from a type of rock called banded iron formation. So one is actually able to use these tiny, tiny grains in order to actually get dates. And then off on the left-hand side there is a reflected light image of a typical analytical site after analysis, 25 micron across spot, but it's only 2 microns deep. And so it's a best, closest you can come to a non-destructive dating technique. And this is not only important for terrestrial materials, but these techniques are used for dating not only rare zircons from the moon to get lunar chronology, but even from shergottites, which are meteorites derived from Mars, so that one can actually start to build up a real chronology about Mars. So what's difficult about reconstructing the earliest geological record? What makes it so different from elsewhere? Well, first of all, most ancient crust has been destroyed by later tectonics. So at the moment, when you're looking at the Hadean, only about 1/1,000,000th of the Hadean crust actually remains on Earth today. All the rest has been destroyed by later tectonics. And this map here shows the various scattered little localities around the world where you can find Eoarchean rocks. But by far the most important and the first discovery site as well is the Nutman, Greenland region. So basically from this very small amount of surviving rocks, you've got to extract as much information about the early Earth. So for example, one of the most fundamental questions is, in the Eoarchean, was there some form of plate tectonics? So why is it so difficult? And that is because of difficulty number 2. Not only do you have a very small amount of preserved geological record, but all the later orogenic events were superimposed, and this has the effect of corrupting the early Eoarchean geological record. So I show here a picture of a housing estate in the US where a tornado has gone through. And in most places, the houses are being completely destroyed. Okay, you can be able to say, oh, they were houses there, but it's very difficult to reconstruct them beyond that. But you just get these little freak areas where, for some reason, because natural systems are chaotic, you can actually get a bit more detailed information about the early Earth. And those sort of areas, they actually form much, much less than 1/1,000,000th of the present crust. So this is what all these tectonic events do to the early geological record. So if you don't recognize these difficulties, it can lead to very differing interpretations of geochemical and isotopic data. So therefore, most of the preserved Eoarchean crust is basically a horrible migmatite. In other words, a mixed rock mess dominated by broadly granitic rocks, so ranging from particularly tonalites, particularly common, through to granites, with bits and pieces of other stuff like diorites and so on in it as well. But this is what you see all over the world in these tiny little remnants of very ancient crust. So this shows a typical outcrop of the migmatites in Greenland, Eoarchean migmatites in Greenland. This shows, again, same sort of story over in Labrador in Canada. It shows the Eoarchean gneisses. So you've got 500 meters of that cliff there of migmatites, and then you've got a detailed picture of them on the right. So you get this complexity on all scales from a very high cliff down to small parts of single outcrops. So in this particular case, you've got so-called tonalitic Paleozoic, in other words, the old bit of the rock, and a slightly younger Neozoic of granitic composition, in other words, a slightly younger bit of the rock, as the white bands there. So you go to somewhere else in the world, you go to the so-called Marian Gneiss complex in Western Australia, and you see exactly the same story. You get this, most places, great complexity, which is very difficult to unravel. So you've got to find the very rare places where this complexity has basically not happened. And 50 years on, the Nook region in West Greenland still has a lot of key information. So there's this belt of Eoarchean rocks, exposure of about 3,000 kilometers squared, ranging from the coast up to a special place by the inland ice called Eoarchean. So we're going to focus on some of that, but first of all, how do you actually find gems in this vast, great big area? Well, basically, along with colleagues, been undertaking systematic geological mapping from the mid-1970s onwards. So that's traversing by day and then old-fashioned map making in the evening. So it's a very slow process. You don't sort of immediately find what you're looking for. Sometimes it takes decades even to find what you're looking for. So amongst that 3,000 square kilometers in Greenland, you've got these little tiny vestiges of stuff which give you a window on the early Earth. So we've even got fragments of the Eoarchean mantle. One's got reasonably well preserved volcanic rocks with pillow structures representing arc-like assemblages. One's got tonalites, which is again juvenile arc crust. We've got granites, remelted crust, and we've also got sedimentary rock. So you've got a very wide range of things that we can look at and start to reconstruct the early Earth. So if you can avoid some of this later deformation, you can actually see what the early Earth crust processes look like, and it's highly variable. So basically in the Eoarchean Greenland area, which is best place to see that, you can see very big range in the rocks over small distances. So for example, the top picture here shows a 3,695 million year old tonalite, which is a grey rock. First of all, cut by little mafic dikes, and then by granite, which is 3,650, okay? And there you can quite clearly see that you've got weak Eoarchean deformation. You can go just a kilometer or so away, and you can actually come across Eoarchean mylonites, where all of that complex geology you can see in the top picture has simply been ground down by a major fault, which was juxtaposing unrelated rocks. So there's a very great complexity in the early Archean history, once you've actually found areas where it's not being corrupted by later events. Okay, so Eoarchean. So what is it? What can it actually tell us about the early Earth? So Eoarchean by the inland ice, it's got the least younger tectonothermal overprint, so the least young metamorphism and deformation over the top of it, and it provides an amazing inventory of early Earth clues. So you can see from this oblique image here that you have got essentially two terrains which have actually got a folded metamorphosed fault in between them, a tectonic boundary. And south of that, all of the rocks are 3,800 million years old. And north of that, the rocks are 3,700 million years old, approximately. And I just indicate sort of two particular things of interest, which are both highly contentious. One shows, for example, mantle rocks with subduction-like zone signatures and even ultra-high pressure metamorphism in the Eoarchean. Another very contentious locality is the presence of 3,700 million year old stromatolites, which not everybody is happy in the interpretation. So the cartoons on the left there try and show how variable the geology is. So the top one shows a cartoon where you haven't had any of this later deformation and metamorphism messing everything up. So you've got a complex story of variably deformed tonalites cut by undeformed granite dikes shown in red, and then cut through by undeformed 3,500 million year old dolerite dikes. So that is a kind of ideal place where you can really extract a lot of information. However, the bottom cartoon there shows a much more typical situation where you have areas of somewhat lower deformation. So the green thing running across there again is one of these dikes, but it is folded and variably deformed and metamorphosed under amphibolite facies. So off on the right-hand side of that diagram, which really matches the field outcrop there, you have these very messed up rocks affected very strongly by late Archean deformation. But even so, because these form a large amount of a complex, you've got to try and get as much information from them as possible. And again, you do that via looking at the zircons, which always end up being complex. So what we have up here is an age plot showing for the Eoarchean zircons. You have two main groups of zircon ages. One group is over 3,800, which actually represents the time of the tonalite being formed, crystallizing as a pristine igneous rock. And then you also have a bunch of zircons, which grew at a bit over 3,600, in other words, in the late Eoarchean, where that was formed by a high-grade metamorphic event, which was remelting the crust. And the zircons, the CL images of the zircons down there, show the great complexity by these superimposed high-temperature events, causing recrystallization and partly resetting the ages of the zircon crystals. On the other hand, if you go and look at the good areas near Isua, shown by the top cartoon there, you can see that the dikes, these 3,500 million year old dikes, are great big fat things just marching across the countryside, whereas on the previous slide, there were these thin amphibolites smeared out into the gneisses. So this shows here that you had, since 3,500 million years ago, very, very little deformation. And over in this scenario here, you have much more simpler, more easy to separate out different components of the gneiss complex. And so, for example, a dated granite sheet there ends up just having a very simple, clean, simple zircon population of a time when that igneous rock formed, with no later complication to the zircons after that. So after quite a few decades of this sort of work, you can start to build up a picture which shows that this so-called Itzak gneiss complex in Greenland didn't form all in one time. You actually have pulses of forming of what's called juvenile or new crust, starting at about 3,900 million years and going in several pulses all the way through to about 3,700, and even one at almost 3,600 60 million years ago. But then you have this flip over to a very different geological scenario, where you no longer have making of juvenile crust, but so-called reworking of a crust. And that is marked actually by a dated high-pressure relic metamorphism. But we'll start exploring some of that later. But this is the kind of story which can be built up over many years and dating of many rocks with a large amount of fieldwork. So another thing about Eoarchean is that very occasionally you've got observable Eoarchean tectonics, which can be integrated with not only the whole rock geochemistry, but also with the dates obtained on the rocks. So in this particular scenario, in one particular fold core, one can find a situation where you've actually got older rocks have been thrust over younger rocks, and then actually the whole lot has been folded. So, for example, we've got this bunch of rocks at the top there, structurally highest, which have got chemistry similar to bonanites, which should be something very familiar to Japanese viewers of this presentation. And they are actually overlying a series of younger rocks, banded iron formations, which is something like 20 to 30 million years younger. So in other words, what we're having is older rock thrust on top of younger rocks. This isn't the sort of thing that you're going to be finding in basically what's called stagnant lid tectonics, something which we'll get on into a moment. Another locality, this is actually not actually at Eoarchean, it's actually in the coastal regions. And in this, we have actual mantle depleted dunite forming, actually sitting in a syncline. And that's mantle dunite is actually bang up against cherty metasedimentary rocks and altered basalts. Of course, it's all been metamorphosed through amphibolite facies. And all of the rocks shown there have been intruded by tonalite with an age of over 3,750 million years. So this is a case where you can actually see slices of mantle emplaced over the upper crust. Again, this is what you'd simply expect in a sort of plate tectonic scenario. So this gets on to plate tectonics scenario. So what sort of plate tectonics was operating in the Eoarchean? Was there some form of plate tectonics, or was the lithosphere shaped entirely by a different process? And this is an event with, or sort of a debate which has been going on forever and ever, basically. So really, ever since plate tectonics emerged, and ever since people started to recognize these very ancient rocks on Earth. So this shows the front cover of Royal Society volume from 1973, meeting on early crustal evolution, and the same arguments are still continuing today. So when you look at the start of the rock record, really sort of the big debate is, was there some form of modified plate tectonics? In other words, plates of lithosphere which were moving laterally relative to each other. But basically, sorry. Wait a second. So basically, was there, so it doesn't mean that it's exactly like plate tectonics, okay? Or was there a so-called stagnant lid regime? Well, there was no lateral movements of bits of the lithosphere, and the crust suffered vertical gravitational instabilities. In other words, drips and plumes, so-called delaminations in the figure below. And when you come to these sort of divergent views, it's very interesting because researchers who actually still study real Precambrian rocks and do fieldwork, geochemistry, they mostly favor that an early transition to plate tectonics on Earth took place. So in other words, there is already some form of plate tectonics in the Eoarchean. On the other hand, researchers who model global processes, for example, by supercomputing simulations of the interior of the Earth, where they have no experience in Precambrian geology, they often favor a late transition to plate tectonics. So this, when one looks at the other silicate planets on Earth, one can sort of see various stages. So, for example, it's regarded that Venus and Mars are in some sort of stagnant lid setting. When you look at Earth's moon and looks at Mercury, one's simply looking at what's called a terminal stagnant lid, where there's no activity going on at all. So the moon, there hasn't been any igneous activity for billions of years. So sometime Earth probably did transition from this so-called heat pipe drips and plumes into some plate tectonics thing, where you're getting subduction occurring and a recycling of the surface lithosphere into the deep Earth, probably right down to the core mantle boundary. So when did this actually start to happen, and what evidence do we have of when it started to happen? So as I said, this debate has been going on ad nauseum for 50 years, or even before. So if you look at the sort of different sorts of models, and I've taken here two lots of block diagrams from a 1973 paper. So there's, for example, the vertical tectonic one at the top, which could be McGregor 1951, or for example, Webb et al. 2020, or some form of lateral lithosphere movement with subduction, which could be Talbot 1973, or some current researchers. So when you look at mantle rocks overlying crustal ones, really you need lateral motions of the lithosphere to do that. And basically, there's no doubt that one has that when one starts looking at the early record, as I showed from one of the field photos before. Another thing that one would be looking for plate tectonics is you'll be looking for mafic and intermediate rocks formed by fluid fluxing, not adiabatic decompression of the mantle, because that's what happens in the mantle wedge at modern convergent plate boundaries. You've got water and other volatiles being driven off the subducted slab and triggering melting in the mantle wedge between the subducted slab and the overlying preserved edge of the plate. And this has got, as we'll see, specific geochemical signatures. Another thing that one's going to be considering of is ultra-high pressure metamorphism. This, of course, is a rare, but definitely a signature of plate tectonics, particularly in subduction zones, but it is something which is really untenable in the stagnant lid vertical tectonics scenario. So let's have a look at the geochemistry of some Eoarchean metabasaltic rocks. In Greenland, there are no komatiites. So instead, when you look at the mafic intermediate rocks, they're actually formed by fluid fluxing and not adiabatic decompression of the mantle. And just an example, taking analyses of basaltic rocks from Isua, with those with ages of 3,720 to 3,710, they sit on this trace element plot. They sit in the arc field where you've had fluid fluxing, and that is being caused by thorium being added to the mantle by slab dehydration. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at rocks like Morb and also komatiites, they form in the so-called mantle array, formed by the simple decompression melting of the mantle, rather than adding fluids to the mantle to trigger the melting. So basically, when you go and look at these ancient rocks, ancient basaltic rocks, they got very common arc signatures to them. So These three cartoons here show three, shall we say, scenarios for what could be happening in the Eoarchean. We got the stagnant lid model, where you actually have the sort of sagging down of a thickened mafic crust, and that thickened mafic crust is then remelting to form tonalites. As you can imagine, in this sort of scenario, it's very difficult, first of all, to get older rocks crust on top of younger ones, and it's also just as difficult to get bits of mantle sliced into and mixed up with bits of crustal rock. Then there's two so-called mobile lid or plate tectonic scenarios. One shows a sort of imbricated convergent plate boundary. We have lots of slices of mafic crust all stacking up. They're catching up little slivers of mantle in between them, and the bottom of that pile is starting to melt to form the tonalites, which are the main rock type in the Eoarchean. And finally, we have something resembling what is actually happening locally along the Andean margin, which is flat subduction, where you just have not the plate diving straight down into the mantle, but it's sliding below the conserved plate, and you've got the melting and tonalite production taking there. So basically, some form of mobile lid plate tectonic-like scenarios such as B and C are actually compatible with all features in the oldest geological record. So as a sort of very quick overview, this is sort of something that could be happening. So first of all, you're getting the first pulse of when you get a break in the oceanic crust. You're getting the melting in the mantle to make the early arc-like basalts, and then you get the later stacking up along that boundary to get the tonalites, which actually then invade everything. And then finally, these blocks of new juvenile crust actually end up colliding, and then in that you get the felsic crustal melts occurring, the granites, secondary granites occurring. So that's really the end of the first bit of the talk. And now I'm going to move on to something focusing particularly on metamorphic constraints on big picture questions in the earth sciences, particularly harking to tectonics. So when you look at this nice painting that somebody did of a very early Hadean, the question is, at some stage in the very early Earth, it must have been like this, basically almost a magma ocean, no retained hydrosphere, in other words, no oceans. But this painting actually shows something which is wrong, and that is the artist should have realized that the basalts would have had very low viscosity, and you wouldn't have sort of Mount Fuji-like volcanoes sticking up. You would have just had very low shield volcanoes making all the volcanism. Okay, so study of metamorphism can provide information on ancient tectonic regimes, particularly if you start finding high pressure metamorphism. This is very difficult to do in any way apart from via subduction or tectonic crustal thickening at convergent plate boundaries. So people have suggested the starter plate tectonics ranging from the near Proterozoic, in other words, only about 1,000 million years ago, all the way back well into the Hadean at about 4,200 million years ago. So this is a very comprehensive summary of global metamorphism through time, done by Brown and Johnson, 2018, a very, shall we say, detailed study. And what we're going to look at is that big area of the question mark there in the Eoarchean, where they provided no information. So basically, we're interested in What sort of metamorphism is there? So if, for example, if one finds a low thermal gradient, in other words, low TP metamorphism, then that would be an indication that maybe that there wasn't plate tectonics with lateral movements of the lithosphere all that time ago. So there is a terrible preservation problem with high pressure metamorphic rocks. So this shows the young eastern part of Australia, which consists of a vast area which was formed at convergent plate boundaries from the start of the Cambrian up into the early Mesozoic, okay? And in that vast area, probably there's only about 100 square meters exposure of actual Cambrian, Permian, blue schist and eclogite, high pressure metamorphic rocks. That single outcrop down there is Australia's best eclogite blue schist outcrop. As you can see from the hammer, not much of it, on a beach at Port Macquarie in New South Wales. So there's always this preservation issue with high pressure metamorphic rocks. And basically I'll skip over that because we've already seen natural systems are naturally chaotic, but basically very rare places you get remnants of the early Archean metamorphism actually preserved in order to start to get some information on tectonic regimes. And again, this is going to be our study area. Most of the metamorphic information comes from near the inland ice, this Isua area, but the coastal area, the other end of the Eoarchean exposures, does also provide some information. So we're going to go to Isua, and we're looking at the 3,700 million year old part of the sequence. And this shows the end of that part of the sequence. And what I've marked on the oblique Google Earth image is a kind of lithological association. So we've got bonanites, we've got andesitic grey whackers, we've got rocks which have got sort of island arc, basalt chemistry, we've got cherts, we've got serpentinites. So for anybody who's worked on convergent plate boundaries, that is a very familiar set of lithologies. And they're all actually as tectonic slices against each other. And those are all then intruded by, first of all, diorites, and then by much larger amounts of somewhat younger tonalites. So what we're going to be doing in this issue about ultra-high pressure metamorphism is we're going to be looking at one body of a metaserpentinite, the so-called lens B, shown there, which has got an assemblage, olivine plus antigerite, that's one of the family of serpentine minerals, plus some very bizarre minerals called titanium chondrodite and titanium clinohumite. With significance of those will come on to later. So those particular phases were first discovered along this train of serpentinites by a guy called Dimmock in 1988. But at that time, the significance of those minerals was not realized. The significance is that those particular minerals and those sort of rocks, they only form at ultra high pressure conditions. So we got a phase diagram there on the left-hand side, which is being constructed from a mixture of thermodynamic calculations integrated with laboratory experiments. And it shows that if you've got titanium chondrodite in these sort of rocks, you've got to be looking at pressures in the order of 2.6 gigapascals. In other words, you are at very great depths, okay? And this shows over here some electron microscope images of some of these things. So it shows the stability of olivine and antigerite in these titanium phases. But this illustrates a very important thing about many aspects of earth sciences. in that in modern earth sciences, critical information on some of the biggest picture questions can be derived from micron scale observations. So when one's looking at these bizarre titanium bearing minerals, one's looking at things which are much, much smaller than 1 micron, sorry, much, much smaller than 1 millimeter across. And so, as I said, this is backed up by experimental work, which shows that if you get this titanochondrite, you've got to be somewhere in the order of 2.6 gigapascals. In other words, 26 kilobars. So very, very high pressures, not the kind of pressure you actually get within crustal metamorphism. So there's also other relics of metamorphism preserved, which are just as telling. And again, this comes from, again, just one single locality in the world where it survived. So this is a so-called high-pressure granulite. High-pressure granulites, you have to have garnet plus clinoproxene plus plagioclase plus quartz in equilibrium. And those kind of assemblage is a diagnostic feature of crustal thickening, tectonic crustal thickening in younger orogenic belts. So again, on the pressure temperature diagram on the left there, I have put on the conditions for that high pressure metamorphism, which is higher temperature but lower pressure than the ultra high pressure preserved in the serpentinites. But then along with that, when you go into an adjacent area, you get the so-called Barrovian kyanite plus staurolite assemblage, which is also an indication of sort of crustal thickening metamorphism. Finally, one can find examples of relatively low pressure, very high temperature metamorphism. And this is just one very rare example where you've got a series of amphibolites, which will derive eventually from basalts before metamorphism. They got an age of over 3,887 million years. And within it, fortuitously preserved in just one or two localities, you have these little patches of melt, which is sort of broadly tonalitic in composition. And those melts are formed in equilibrium with orthopyroxene crystals. So here we have melt formed with orthopyroxene, not with clinoproxene and garnet. In other words, indicating lower pressure conditions of metamorphism. So that is indicated there for that metamorphism. So as you can see, you're actually getting a very wide range of metamorphic conditions on the early Earth. So that shows, first of all, the three ranges of metamorphic peak condition metamorphic conditions preserved. But there's another, what I call the elephant in the room. And that is most of the early Eoarchean crust is made of this igneous rock called tonalite, which is formed by the melting of mafic rocks. But the geochemistry, particularly the trace element geochemistry, indicates that these were formed by melting of mafic rocks, which have been converted to eclogites. And this is because the trace element geochemistry of these tonalites, which dominate the earliest crust, they show that they left behind a residual in the melting domain, rich in garnet plus or minus rutile. Because you actually had evidence that most of the early crust was formed by the melting of eclogites, then actually early Earth geodynamics must have involved widespread high pressure metamorphism. So this is a summary of the state of play with the information put on. So in the Eoarchean, observed rather than modeled metamorphic regimes range from sort of low pressure, high temperature through to very high pressure, lower temperature. basically, the other thing is, of course, Archean tonalite formation. Tonalites forming the vast amount of Archean crust. They needed extensive high pressure metamorphism before the rocks started to melt. So there is a diversity of Eoarchean metamorphic range. Basically, the best way to explain this evidence is particularly the high pressure and ultra high pressure metamorphism is there were lateral lithosphere movements, in other words, some form of plate tectonics in deep time. Okay, so the takeaway message from the rare Eoarchean metamorphic tectonic samples in Greenland. First of all, Greenland's Eoarchean metamorphic record integrated with rock types and structural geology fits some form of convergent plate boundary processes, followed by collisional orogeny. It doesn't mean to say that, if you like, the architecture was exactly the same as in modern plate tectonics, but there is obviously some form of movement of lateral movements of bits of the lithosphere at that time. Yeah, the ancient geodynamics then resembled the duality of modern systems. So you have plate tectonics with lateral movements of lithosphere, and also hotspot magmatic activity. So, for example, when you go to quite a lot of the somewhat younger Paleoarchean geological record, it actually does look more like hotspot magmatic activities. There is no need to invoke an entirely non-uniformitarian theoretical scenario for the Eoarchean Earth. So Earth transitioned from this non-uniformitarian state, such as a stagnant lid seen on Mars, very early, and certainly probably before 3,100 million years. So finish with this question: what substance makes Earth unique and may be responsible for triggering plate tectonics? It is something that Earth has, and none of the other silicate bodies in the solar system have. Okay, I think it would be pretty obvious what that substance is. So for the last part of my talks, is going to be astrobiology a little bit, and the start of life on Earth. And again, this is a nice artistic picture here showing probably sometime in the Archean. The artist here has done a better job. The oceans are shown green, which is very reasonable, because there is very high dissolved Fe2 plus in the oceans under the anoxic atmosphere. Okay, so life. We take it for granted, but what does it actually need? So life is chemistry, and life as we know it, it's all carbon, hydrogen, oxygen based, with a little bits of other things thrown in. So the most important thing is, where does the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen come from? And this is a rather different rendition of the periodic table, because it shows on it where all the various different elements come from. So hydrogen, that comes from the Big Bang, more than 13 billion years ago. And then color-coded are the origin of all the other elements. Some are generated in large stars, some supernovae, and then right down the bottom, you actually have ones which are actually made by us in reactors. So as you can see, when you look at the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, it came from the Big Bang, but for the other essential carbon and oxygen, it actually had to be formed in stars, particularly large stars, in order to have the ingredients of life present. Again, life as we know it needs a rocky silicate planet for its home. So what's the origin of the silicon and the iron? Which are the, should we say, the most essential components of a silicate planet? Well, again, if you look at this special rendition of the periodic table, you can actually see, of course, you've got the oxygen full of silicates, you've got the silica, you've got to generate that in stars, and again, the iron, you've got to generate that in stars. In other words, until the first birth life-death cycle of the first stars in the universe, life was not possible. So this is a chronology of the history of the universe from the Big Bang. And it took some time then for the first stars to manufacture the carbon, oxygen, silica, and iron. So in that very first bit, first 2 billion years or so, probably there is no possibility of life as we know it at all. When you come back and look at our own planet, Sun formed 4.56 billion years ago, and as we'll see, there's certainly good evidence from computational genetics that there was already DNA on Earth about 4 billion years ago. So that gives you some idea of how long it takes to go from DNA to sentient life. It takes about 4 billion years. So if you then translate that back to the possibility of the first life in the universe, it can actually show that there probably were already sentient beings in the universe long before our solar system actually formed. So that's just a little dip into astrobiology, and we'll now come and look at our own planet. So when you look at genetic modeling, it places Luca, which is the last universal ancestor, at or before about 4 billion years ago. So you've got to have a series of events or processes before that, leading up to the emergence of DNA. We think that that happened, took about 300 million years. So by about 4.2 billion years ago, there is evidence for oxygen isotope evidence of the older surviving crystals on Earth that 4.2 billion years ago, there was already a wet surface on Earth and weathering reactions were already happening. So 4.2 billion years ago, the surface of the planet was wet and therefore possibility for the start of life. And you've got to go through 300 million years, sort of pre-biotic synthesis, various sorts of polymers that then end up being enclosed in vesicles and then through to protocells. So that's a sort of 300 million year time frame in order to go through all those stages. Going back a very, very long time, decades, I think almost a century now, people started doing experiments and they're able to show that if you had boiling water with some other things in it, electric sparks and so on, that you could, in very short time, generate a very wide range of organic molecules in just a few days. So accurate or not, this sort of experiment showed that in a geologically short time, a large array of organic molecules were fabricated on the early Earth. So 300 million years in isn't, impossible in order to generate life. We know that's the case because, of course, we're here actually talking about it. There's a lot of debate about the kind of environments where this happened, where the so-called pre-biology steps occurred. However, one thing is clear from people looking at genetics, is that the deep roots of life are organisms that flourish at high temperatures, greater than or equal to 600 degrees Celsius. So some form of hot environment, whether it be deep sea smokers, whether it be on the fringe of surface, sort of hot springs and so on, it looks like life is rooted in a hot environment. So again, Eoarchean area in Greenland has the best record of Eoarchean life. And most of it, again, is found in the 3,700, 3,800 million-year-old rocks of the Eosu supercrustal belt, but some also come from out on the coastal region there. So again, Isua, and again, returning to my analogy here, and this is because there's rare instances where the rock's a little deformed, and also there's some slices there which are only heated during metamorphism to a maximum of about 550 degrees Celsius throughout the whole of their greater than 3,600 million year old history. In all other areas, surviving Eoarchean rocks have been heated to much higher temperatures and were strongly deformed. This destroys all original features, and it's very easy to demonstrate this. Let's take a picture of Darwin, some obviously extremely recognizable. If you then deform Darwin by a 10-to-1 ratio, you end up with this smear at the bottom, and nobody would necessarily recognize that as Darwin or a life form. And this is a problem that ductile deformation and the heating of these ancient rocks causes. So most of the search for early life in these rocks has been based on chemofossils, in other words, particularly isotopic signatures which show that life might have been present. So the oldest, if you like, evidence for life coming from Isua is looking at carbon isotopes. So this here shows an outcrop of 3,700 approximately million-year-old metaturbidites derived from sort of andesitic sources. And within these turbidites, you've got actually flakes of graphite. And these graphites have got extremely isotopically light carbon. Okay, and this is taken as maybe an indication of biomediation. So what happens is that the organisms, when they die, go to the seafloor, metamorphose, the reduced carbon in them eventually ends up as graphite with this isotopically very light signature. Okay, so that's shown for the reduced carbon, black, on that graph on the left there, isotopically very light. What is shown here also as a red bar is stromatolite carbonate. In other words, we're looking not at reduced carbon, but carbon which is forming part of an oxide-bearing, oxygen-bearing mineral. So we'll be looking at that in a little while. So this is now quite widely accepted as evidence that there was life on Earth already 3,700 million years ago, and that matches very well with the basically the genetic modeling, which showed that life was already existing at that time. So you've got two completely different brands of science converging and giving you the same answer, showing the great antiquity of life. So there's this bunch of rocks called the banded iron formations. These are rocks which now consist largely of quartz and iron oxide minerals, mostly magnetite and or hematite. And starting from the 1970s, for example, Cloud 1973, biomediation has been proposed as a process in making these rocks. Okay, if this is correct, then Isua has over 1,000 million tons of early life as of evidence at somewhere called Iron Mountain, right at the edge of the Greenland ice cap. And there is increasing more sophisticated evidence that this might be the case. So, for example, people have been looking at the iron isotopes of these sorts of rocks, and they find that they actually have iron isotopic signatures of anoxygenic photosynthesis. So there is certainly good evidence that banded iron formations might have been involved biomediation in their formation. But this is, as I say, these are all chemofossils, isotopic signatures. But is there any tangible, in other words, macroscopic evidence of life at Isua, such as stromatolites? Stromatolites are to be found in carbonate-bearing rocks. And for those of you who don't know, stromatolites are accumulates of carbonate sediment formed by the action of photosynthesizing bacteria. And when throughout most of the Precambrian, they are the most widespread evidence of life. So they're a sort of fossil. They're not sort of fossil in the sense of bones from a dinosaur or a shell. They are basically a construct which is produced by life. So, for example, in the modern world, if you go and look at a termite mound, that is something which is produced by life, but it isn't actually life itself. So stromatolites can be regarded in the same light. So this shows a stromatolite discovery locality. And again, this tiny area here is the only place in the world where these have been discovered at such age. So the ringed area there, the yellow ring around it, the key locality was hidden under a snowbank since before 1968, judging from old aerial photographs, until actually the late 2000s. And this shows what these things actually look like. They're carbonate-rich metasedimentary rocks. And you can see running along a few layers there on that one little bit of the outcrop, you've got these funny bumps. And those bumps are the relict stromatolites. Stromatolites form, like basically the microorganisms form these sort of lumps in order to keep above accumulating sediment on the sea floor, because they're photosynthesizing. If they get completely buried, then of course they're extinguished. So that's what it looks like on the outcrop. It's just a flat outcrop showing a section through the things. And it's part of a stratigraphy that one can reconstruct. So below the stromatolites, you've got a series of meta-andesites, which got an age of 3,709 plus or minus 10 million years. And those pillows shown there in the volcanic pillows, they actually are younging up into the overlying sedimentary rocks in this fault core. Locally, along that top surface of the meta-andesites and metabasalts, you locally have a polymicta conglomerate at an unconformity. And then overlying that, you get a diversity of extremely rarely preserved rock types. So you get the proposed relic stromatolite shown on the left there. You get things called storm breccias, basically formed by churning up of partly consolidated sediment by storm waves. And then we've also got extremely rare cross-spreading. And all of these are occurring in carbonate-rich rocks, and they all show a shallow water environment. Finally, above that, stratigraphically above it, you actually have a banded water, banded iron formation, which formed in a deeper water environment. And this can be dated at slightly younger by volcanic ashfall coming into those banded iron formations. So this is a kind of scenario that you can very typically find at younger times in the Eoarchean. So we've only got 2D sections on the outcrop through the stromatolites. And of course, a lot of people think of stromatolites like the lumps there in the bottom left, where basically, in fact, a lot of stromatolites don't look like that. They'll actually look more like ridge-like forms. So basically, where you get those sort of lump-like stromatolites, they're basically where biological forces are not being moderated much by high-energy water movements, whereas the ridge-like forms are being formed where you've got sort of more higher energy water environments, and you're ending up with stromatolite ridges. So how can we look at the 3D form of these? Well, what we've done is we've taken a sawn slab through these, and like you show there, and by X-ray computed tomography, you can actually see all the way through that block. And you can see it's basically the high energy ridge form. This shows one of the sort of the snaps through that computed tomography through the block. where you can see the color contrast is due to different amounts of the dolomite, carbonate, and quartz. And you can quite clearly see the bowed upward section of the stromatolite and the flat-lying sedimentary rocks above and below. So these are formed of something called dolomite. Okay, the dolomite carbonate is a calcium carbonate. And I won't go into details here, but in terms of its rare earth and yttrium trace element signatures, it's got a classic seawater-like signature. If you took a coral from Australia's Great Barrier Reef, it would essentially have the same trace element, rare earth and yttrium signature as these extremely ancient carbonates in Isua. Another interesting thing is that when you actually look at their carbon isotope signatures, they've got the same signature as modern marine carbonates. So there's no question that these sedimentary rocks, these dolomitic sedimentary rocks, which even include things with the stromatolite structures, they're definitely sedimentary. Which comes on to an interesting thing, the so-called dolomite problem. Dolomite is named after somebody called Count Dolomieu. He was a French soldier, scientist, and revolutionary. He was the discoverer of dolomite. Okay. The interesting thing about dolomite, it's extremely common in the geological record in sedimentary systems, but it has never been grown abiologically in the laboratory. And this is despite to do so for almost 200 attempts to do so for almost 200 years. So this is two examples of papers about it. Somebody actually ran an experiment for 32 years trying to do it and wasn't able to precipitate dolomite in a sterile environment. However, as soon as you add certain microbial organisms to such systems, in literally days, you get dolomite growing. So this has been seen in a whole range of natural environments, like sabkas. It's been seen in deep boreholes, in the waters in deep boreholes, and it's of course been seen in experimental situations in the lab. Therefore, just simply finding this dolomite with seawater-like chemistry, trace element chemistry, and also the carbon isotope signature, this is the very presence of this dolomite can be used as a live proxy. So I'll finish with that by basically saying, when you look at the Eoarchean, it wasn't like either of those pictures that you can see at the bottom, one being a sort of a snowball, completely frozen planet, and the other one a dry, hellish place. It was certainly benign with life, as shown in the painting at the top there. And at that point, I'll finish my presentation. So, are there any questions from anybody?
There was one chat.
One chat, all right.
Where there was a question on. I can just read it out. Hi,
Yeah.
Alan. Is the idea that a planet would cycle between the two models, or if not, is it more likely to move from stagnant lid to tectonic motion, or vice versa?
Yes, well, again, that's a matter of ongoing debate. But certainly, if you like, one thing in the equation that must be there right from the very early days is some form of lateral plate movement. Of course, there is also plumes and so on taking place, and I never understand why people have got to argue for just one or just the other. I like to take the case of, if you imagine an alien scientist visiting Earth, one of those scientists goes to, shall we say, Indonesia. One of those scientists goes to Hawaii. And that's all of a planet that they saw. They would come back with completely different views of modern Earth geodynamics, but both of them would be right.
Okay, and I'm not sure whether Charlie Hughes is is here or not. Yeah, he's yes, responded. Yeah, okay.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Not so okay. So I think we will conclude this lecture.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Alan, for the wonderful wonderful presentation on Greenland. So I think it's for the young students who have to find their new new model or new way of thinking of how old rocks can help understand Earth evolution. Thank you so much. And if we are asking the students to give select some topics and give report for this lecture. And so if some students give report on your lecture, then we will forward it to you. Okay.
Okay, and I'll give them feedback. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much once again, and